Well, good evening, everybody. It is wonderful to be in front of you all again for this last time. It's been a treasure this summer to get to have the opportunity to be the preaching intern, and I've gotten to learn a lot of things. Now, have you ever asked why God does things the way He does? I personally did a lot, especially when I was a child. I wanted to know why God did things the way He did all the time. Why did God put a stinger on a wasp, right? I'd ask my parents all sorts of questions like this. Why did He put a stinger on a wasp if all that wasp was going to do was sting me, right? Why did God create sharks in the first place, right? Like, do they really need to exist in the ocean? Like, we could have just not had them in the first place. The world would have been fine. I wanted to know why the sky was blue, right? Which I'm sure that parents that have had toddlers before have understood the common nature of these questions, and I wasn't satisfied with because God made it that way. I wanted a real answer. And most of the time, the answer I was given to questions about why God did things the way He did was, when you get to heaven, you can ask Him yourself. And I think my parents were more so tired of me asking questions than trying to find an answer. But I was very curious to understand why God acted the way He did, and in some ways I think that I still am like that today. I think that many of us in this room actually have a curiosity towards why God acted the way He did, and why He still does today, but I think that we ask different questions. I don't think our questions are as whimsical as, why are there stingers on wasps? I think we ask more down-to-earth questions. I think that we ask questions like, why does God allow evil in my life? Why does God allow me to suffer and other people to prosper? Right? Why does God allow sickness in this world? Why does He allow poverty and war and famine if He's a just God? I think that these are questions all of us ask from time to time, especially when we're personally going through something. And I think that sometimes we even ask, why, God, if you listen to my prayers, does nothing ever happen right for me? Sometimes we can question if God is even there at all. And tonight, we're going to look at a time when someone asked God a few questions, and even in a way challenged Him and the nature of who He is. And then we're going to try to see how we can learn to ask questions of our own and how to be better servants of God. And now, many of you are probably expecting us to turn to Job about a man who asked questions of God, and we're not going to go there tonight. You might be thinking we're going to go to Abraham, right? Because he asked God questions about Sodom and Gomorrah, you know? But we're not going there either. Tonight, we're going to go to the book of Habakkuk in the Minor Prophets. And Habakkuk asks a few questions about God and why He does things the way that He does. And I think for us to understand this question he's going to ask, we need to understand some background. But the question that he's going to ask is, why do the good suffer and evil prosper? So, some backstory for you to understand why Habakkuk asks this question. Habakkuk grew up in a time that was very different from ours. He grew up in a time when Judea was the only place left that had God's chosen people. You see, God had risen up kings in Israel, and eventually we know that there was Saul, and then there was David and Solomon. But after Solomon, there was Solomon's child who was too harsh on the people, and so the people left him, and there was a divide in the kingdoms between Judah and Benjamin and the rest of God's people. And eventually, the Israelites who were in Israel acted wicked and didn't follow God. And so God brought in the Assyrian nation and wiped out all of the people in Israel. And that left just Judah. And Judah did good for a period of time, but soon enough, after Josiah's death, the last good king of Judah, very shortly after, God puts in judgment against them as well. But we see terrible kings rise up over and over again, and there's injustice in this kingdom of Judah. And Habakkuk lives at the end of one of the last kings of Judah. And he's asking, why, God, is there evil around me? Why do you allow there to be a ruler in place who's wicked? Why do I have to suffer if I'm one of your righteous people? So with that being said, let's actually read what he says. If you would, please turn to Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. There we go. Habakkuk 1, 1 through 4. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Habakkuk, if you notice, has been crying for deliverance for a long time. He says, how much longer, God, do I have to cry out for help? Meaning that he's been doing this not since the writing of this book, but for a long time. Habakkuk wants to know, how long will God let evil suffer? And notice how he describes how God acts. He says that God does not hear. He says that God does not save, and he says that God watches idly. Habakkuk is asking in an accusing way of God, why don't you do, God, what you're supposed to? If you really are all-knowing and all-powerful and you're righteous, then why do you allow evil to exist? Why do you allow wicked people to rule? And why do I have to be the one that watches this iniquity take place? And sometimes we doubt God too. We're not just reading Habakkuk because he was a minor prophet that God wanted us to read in Scripture, but we're reading Habakkuk because he gives us insight into our own lives. He's not the only person that's ever questioned God. In fact, I think most people on this earth have questioned at one time or another why things happen the way they do. I know that personally, I've struggled in the past, right, with why does evil happen? Why do harsh things happen in my life? And it's easy to play this doubt game, right, this blame game with God, saying, if God was real, then my mother wouldn't have cancer. If God was real, then I wouldn't have health problems. If God was real, financial trouble would be no thing for me, right? I wouldn't have family troubles. I wouldn't have financial troubles. I wouldn't have health troubles. Everything would be going right for me, much less simple things in this life, right? Think, like if God could do anything, and if God was all-knowing and all-powerful, I shouldn't have to sit in Georgia traffic. God would be able to let me go right on through and let everyone else get out of the way. But obviously, that's not how God acts. And I think that there's one thing that really differentiates us from Habakkuk, because both Habakkuk and we ask questions of God about why things happen in our lives. But if you'll notice in verse 1, Habakkuk is a prophet, and God is going to speak directly to Habakkuk and answer him. So remember that Habakkuk has asked, how long, O Lord, will you let evil continue? And God gives a pretty straightforward answer. If you'll look in Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, and I ran out of room on the PowerPoint, so we'll flip, don't worry. Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men, whose own might is their God. God answers Habakkuk's question quite quickly. When Habakkuk asks, how long, O Lord, will you allow this? Then notice that he says in verse 5 to be astounded, because I'm doing it quickly in verse 6. Behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. And when is this going to happen? In your days, Habakkuk. You will see justice be executed. But there's another problem here, because this is not the solution that Habakkuk wants. If you'll notice the description of the character of these people, they are bitter, they're hasty, they're dreaded and fearsome, they're violent people, they are scoffers who refuse authority, and finally, they're guilty men. These Chaldeans, who we better know as the Babylonians, are wicked people who are worse than God's own. Habakkuk doesn't like the description of God's supposed solution, because the solution is worse than the problem in his eyes. You're going to allow a wicked nation who's worse than your own people to rise up and overtake yours. And in the same way, sometimes when we ask God questions and he gives us a solution, it's not the answer we were looking for. Sometimes the answer seems ironically the opposite of what we had asked from God. Habakkuk cried out to God to stop evil and injustice. And in response, God said, I will destroy this evil and injustice with more evil and more injustice. And this is more than just a description of a future event for Habakkuk. We have to remember that Habakkuk wasn't just a character in the Bible, but that he was a real person, right? Can we think that Habakkuk was a person that had no connections to the people around him? Habakkuk probably had family. He probably had a brother and a sister. He could have had nephews and nieces. He could have had a wife and child of his own. And Habakkuk just heard the news that they're going to be overtaken and put into captivity by a nation who is wicked. And I think that sometimes we receive bad news too that's the opposite of what we would like. As I'm sure many of you know, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. Now, this happened at the end of last semester. And at the end of that semester, my mom called and told me that she had a mass on her chest. And I had prayed so hard that that mass would not be cancerous. But in the end, of course, it was. And she's gone through treatments now. And she's been doing well, but that prayer that I prayed so fervently was not answered how I asked. It was the opposite of what I wanted. And so Habakkuk asks another question that are both, like the last one, very relatable and also very challenging to the character of God. If you'll notice, Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 12 through 13. He says, Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil, and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? Habakkuk asks another question that's simple in its nature, but difficult in the response. He says, if you are a loving God, if you are so holy you can't even look at evil, you refuse it to be in your gaze, then God, why do you allow evil to remain on this earth? Why do you allow someone who does righteously to be swallowed up by the man who is wicked? And I think that we, again, ask these same questions. Do we not occasionally ask God why there's poverty that's going on in this earth, why someone who we love is suffering, why wars are going on continually? We notice, just like Habakkuk did, this apparent gap between the image of who God is in our minds and the reality of the world around us. And this is displayed in current events that are going on. I mean, you can look at the Texas floodings that just happened recently and the pain and suffering that was caused from that. And we can say, how, God, could you allow this to happen? If you are good, why does evil reign? But notice that Habakkuk doesn't ask the questions the same way we do. Habakkuk has a heart that's different from yours and mine typically. And here's how he's different from even Job and from Abraham. If you would, let's read Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Notice that he calls the questions he's asking a complaint. He recognizes that he is lesser, that he needs to be humble before the Lord his God, because God, in the end, really does not have to answer Habakkuk questions. He doesn't need to get up and explain himself to any person because he's greater than all those he's created. And Habakkuk recognizes this. And I think that Habakkuk has some record of this to show. When we think of Job, we think of a man who lost everything, and he has questions to ask God. He compares his situation to a courtroom where he's going to show how he's innocent, and he asks God to be his witness. And yet when he asks God questions about why this is happening to me, do we remember God's response? He doesn't give an answer to Job. He says, gird up your loins and answer me like a man. If you can answer the questions I have to ask, then I'll answer yours. And after the end of chapters and chapters of Job getting these questions asked of him, he eventually says, that's my bad, God. I realize that I'm lesser. And God never gives an answer to Job. Or think about Abraham, who when he was in in the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he was bargaining with God. God, are you really so unrighteous that you would allow this many righteous people to perish in a city? And God says, no, not for those. And he slowly whittles him down to a number. But remember that God in the end still judges that city for its wickedness. That even though God is merciful and loving, he is a God who is greater than us. And Habakkuk recognizes this. And so he asks, how is he going to answer my complaint? Right? Because in really his eyes and in God's eyes, this is a complaint about why his life isn't going right. So, with that being said, let's see how God answers Habakkuk's question. Well, first, we'll notice that there is an entire chapter of God explaining Habakkuk's question. All of chapter 2 is God's response. And we're not going to take the time to read the entirety of chapter 2 tonight, because we've already gone long enough for chapter 1. But we'll notice that the first response is found in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. It says, "And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him. But the righteous shall live by his faith." The first thing we'll realize is that God allows evil to happen, but he will still protect those who follow him. God tells Habakkuk this news and says this has to be sent out. Notice that in verses 2 and 3. This message is not something that's just going to be told to you, Habakkuk. You are going to take this message and write it, and messengers are going to go and proclaim it to all of Judah. Because the unrighteous are going to hear this message, and the righteous will too. And what is that message that Habakkuk is given? That the unrighteous will be judged, but that the righteous will live. And so for Habakkuk, when he's complaining about these people who are around him, who are doing wickedly, God says, they will be punished, but the righteous people who are in my city will not be left to die just like the wicked. There will be a response for them. And I think this brings us into a question about why God is even doing this. Why is he taking over and destroying his own people? And I think that we have to recognize, like Habakkuk did, that God is holy, and that his holiness isn't just that he doesn't stay around evil, but that anyone who claims to be his must also be holy. And so when these people, these Israelites, who had these commandments for how to keep themselves clean, and how when they fall away from doing what's right to give sacrifices, when they stop following God, they start going after other gods, he has to cleanse his own people. This is a redemptive plan that he's enacting. This judgment that he's proclaiming on this nation of Judah is not just to punish these people and to wipe them out. You have to remember that out of the tribe of Judah will eventually arise a lion, and that this plan that God is enacting is not just vengeance or him being vindictive because he's upset at his people. And so he is going to keep the righteous safe. And I think that these three answers we have to recognize are not just one question and then one answer and then another answer and then another answer. These are intertied, because the answer of why God allows evil on this earth as a holy God is not a simple answer, right? It's not a 5-second response. And in the same way, it took a whole chapter for God to explain. And so in the same way, these three responses are tied together. You can't take one of these away and still expect the answer to make sense. So number 2, God does not allow evil to reign forever, and that these people who are on borrowed time are only going to be used as a tool for God to execute judgment. These wicked men are not going to live forever. This nation that's rising up is not going to remain over Judah for all of time. God says himself that he refuses to allow these people to remain forever. And let's look at that in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. "Shall not all these take up their taunt against him, with scoffing and riddles for him, and say, Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them. Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnants of the peoples shall plunder you. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them." God uses this idea that I think is easier for us to grasp than just the idea of wicked people being brought in over others. He gives this idea of debtors and creditors. And I think that this idea becomes more apparent when we think about someone who doesn't understand how credit works, and they go to a credit card company and they say, I'd like a credit card, and they think that that means they have free money up to $10,000 or however much is on the card. And so they go and spend it on all these useless things, right, on all these things that are going to lose value, and they don't realize that all the things they've spent this money on is not free for them, but rather it has to be paid back. And not only does it have to be paid back to what they spent, but it now has interest on it, right? This idea of them rising up is a similar idea to the creditors biting back out what is theirs. And that these nations who Babylon is taken from will eventually take back what is theirs. Because God is not going to allow these people who do wrong over and over and over again to prosper. In fact, if you know the history of what happens soon after Habakkuk, you'll know that Babylon only holds sway over Judah for about 70 years before they are taken over themselves. God does not allow these wicked men to live forever. And in our lives, sometimes we ask God for justice, not just from natural problems going on in the world, but because someone has acted against us wrongly. And God ensures that the wicked people who hear his words know that there is a day coming where they will be judged, each according to their works. Even if you personally don't see the justice done against someone, God will pay them back for it. And Paul talks about this concept in Romans chapter 12, verses 18 through 19, where he says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. As Christians, our job is not just to see ourselves that justice is served, because we have a God who will provide justice for us. He says, Habakkuk, I know all you see in your life is injustice and violence and wrong, but I can see further than you, and I will execute justice on these people. You might think that something is going on that's completely against my nature. I've already built up a plan to stop this from happening. And in our lives, we have to realize that when things go wrong, this earth isn't determined as our final place for justice to be had, but rather we're going to have an eternal home with him if we remain faithful. And finally, there's a third point in this, and it's that God uses the problems that are in this world to create solutions that show his glory. God is not going to just wipe out people over and over again. He, in the end, is going to show his glory, his mercy, and his justice. This is shown in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 12 through 14. If we could read that real quick. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that people labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? And notice this next verse. Really think about it. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. God is not going to allow evil to reign forever. And not only is he going to stop it, but he's going to use it in his plan to show his own glory. God is going to make things work out. And this passage beautifully describes how God is going to use these rebellious people to make certain that his glory is known. He says that the knowledge of his glory will cover the earth, just like how the water covers the ocean, in that it is so full of water you can't even see the depths of it. And in the same way, God's glory will be shown by those who live on this earth who know him. And another point to this, Paul again describes in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, an often misquoted passage. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, according to those who are called, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, this passage doesn't mean that there's going to be no pain and suffering for the Christian. It doesn't mean that everything's going to go right on this earth, because if that were the case, we wouldn't have problems in this day and age. But rather, it means that God is going to help you to get through these problems. Eventually, even if it seems hopeless, that these things that are going through your life will be used for good. even if it's not you personally who sees that good. God will find a way to make things look good even in the middle of bad circumstances. Even if it's hopeless and everything's crumbling around you and there's nothing positive in your life going on because of the problems, God will find a way to eventually make that terrible situation good for at least someone else. He's going to make sure that in the end things work together for good. And again, this answer is not the whole picture. These 3 points that I've given you are not the entirety of the reasons of why God would allow evil to remain on this earth. But this is just a glimpse of it. And I think that this is a valid point to discuss because he doesn't give Habakkuk a book long of answers as to why evil's allowed to reign. He gives him a little snippet of an answer. And that's because God's vision is greater than Habakkuk's. To Habakkuk, this whole world seemed like a place of injustice. It seemed like a place without mercy, and it seemed like a place where evil was allowed to reign. And God tells him that his small view of the world is nothing compared to what God can see, and that the injustice you might see at the moment is going to be used for good one day. And of course, we can see this with Habakkuk's circumstances, that God will eventually ensure that his people remain faithful, and that one day Jesus is going to be born to come into this world, not just for the Israelites, right, but for the entire world, that all may follow him. And that God has a redemptive plan that Habakkuk couldn't see. And so, what do we do? How are we supposed to respond realizing that God has a bigger picture in this world than the one that we can see in this moment? Well, Habakkuk responds with a prayer and a song. And this song is one that describes the holiness, the justice, and the saving powers of his God. The very things that he was complaining that God lacked in the first chapter of this book. And notice that this prayer and song takes up all of the third chapter. And so I'd like for us to read the end of this song and see how Habakkuk personally reacts. Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 16 through 19. I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places, to the choir master with stringed instruments. Habakkuk doesn't immediately feel relief at God's answer that justice will come about. Habakkuk still feels the problems that occur when you know you are going to be on the side of punishment. He has his body trembling, his lips quiver. He feels rotten to the core. And yet, he says that God is his joy and his strength, that even though this terrible situation is going to occur, he still trusts in God. And I think that it's interesting how he describes how God helps him through his circumstances. He says that God is his strength. He doesn't say he removes the high places. He says that he strengthens his feet so he can walk on them. Now, my mom might have not, just not had cancer, but she's gotten help every step of the way to get what she needs. She's had doctors who have helped her, who have gotten her through procedures. She's had a loving family that's been there for her. And even more so, she's had a church family that's made meals for her that has helped her at every step of the way very generously. And in the same way, God does things in our lives so that even though we have to face punishment in severe circumstances, he is going to make sure we can get through it. He is our strength. Now, because of that, we must retain our trust in God. One preacher once said that nothing ever leaves you where it finds you. Our lives are constantly changing, and our faith can change with the difficulties in life when we let it. When we face trials and difficulties, do we feel like giving up? There's really only two responses to the kind of trouble that we face. Either we can give up. We can say that if all these bad things are happening in my life, God must not be real, or at least the God that I would want to serve. Or rather, we can be like Habakkuk and praise God even in the troubles of our lives. God has promised us a life if we do follow him. And not just a life of continued existence on this earth. Rather, he's going to give us a life greater with him for eternity. So if there's any way that we can assist you tonight, if you need prayers from the church to strengthen you or to help you through hard times, or if you've not experienced the strength that God can provide you because you haven't followed him, then please come forward as we stand and as we sing.